At this time, I'd like to turn it over to my friend, Renee Fontenot. Renee, how are you?
I'm good, Ryan. Good to see you today.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. And I want to say hello and welcome to all of you who are here today joining us. And as Ryan said, please do put any questions you have in the chat, and I'll get to those at the end and follow up with you. What I want to do is share with you how I have changed typical case analysis that typically done in strategic marketing or a marketing management course, those types of senior level or graduate level courses, and how I've taken it from being that what happened analysis to what should happen going forward. So moving cases from not just regurgitating and rehashing what a client did, but where they could go. And more importantly, what I've done is created a textbook that has cases that are not Google searchable. So everything is masked. So the companies, though all based on real companies, real situations, real problems, they won't be able to easily Google the solutions, which we know they often do. And I've also created 3 communities, Smallville, Midville, and Granville, which serves as the foundation for these cases. So you have the option of assigning a case and a particular community. The cases are small and medium-sized companies because there are a plenitude of large companies out there that we can find cases for. But let's be honest, that's not where most of our students are going to go work. They're going to work for small and medium-sized companies. So I have focused on moving the case study, case analysis process to strategic planning. Let me go ahead and get started with why we would want to do this and some of the benefits. I'm very concerned with the professional development of students. And so to that, I look to have those skills that future employers want and need integrated into the process of my classes. And so some of the skills that employers are looking for are the ability to work in teams. So these cases suit themselves well for assigning as a team, but they could easily be assigned as individual work as well. And I've done it both ways. It forces students have to make decisions, to analyze situations, to collect additional research beyond the case, which oftentimes cases don't require that necessarily. It requires them to plan and organize and to practice those skills that employers really want, and that's the ability to communicate in written and oral form. So I make students give oral reports based upon their formal written reports. It teaches them, of course, the skills and how they're going to develop it, and gives them the ability to create a future-looking plan that they have the practice to replicate in their own future businesses. So let's talk about the strategic plan. The strategic plan is future focused, where case analysis tends to look back and says, okay, what was the situation that got them to this problem? But it rarely makes them deep dive into what they should do for the future. The strategic plan speaks to the client. It's written for the client, not about the client. And that's a different tone of voice that students often struggle to do, because most of what they've always written has been about somebody, about something, about some time period. And now they have to talk to that client. And that's a different kind of writing. It allows them the opportunity, and frankly, requires them the opportunity to do research beyond the textbook, beyond the case, because in order to make it relevant, they need to do timely research based upon if this was happening right now, and the cases are all relevant to things going on. Some of them take into consideration the pandemic and COVID virus as relevant to their situations, but still, what are the things in the industry that are changing? They need to go do those research. And there will be tools in the textbook that helps to guide them on best practices for finding research, current research that they should look for, and the links to various sites where a lot of information can easily be found. But it should also encourage them to go beyond that and find additional research to support their solutions. They need to work to find realistic solutions for their clients. These clients do not have millions of dollars of resources and capital and other things that they can draw on. These are small and medium-sized companies, so they'll have to fit their solutions to the confines and constraints of those organizations. It also provides them an opportunity to look beyond just not what could be a solution, but how would that organization actually implement it, getting down to the nuts and bolts of the when, what, where, and how. This is the structure that I use in my class. First is that I talk to the students about the situation analysis that they have looked at in previous classes, and that's a situation analysis that got them to the problem. In a strategic plan, there needs to be a situation analysis research section, but it is not what happened. The client knows that. They lived it, they did it, they know it better than anybody. It has to be what's going to be the situation that will take them beyond their problem. So as with any formal paper, there's the front material, there's the cover sheet, the table of contents, an executive summary, an introduction that tells us why we're reading this paper and how it's organized. And then there's the body of the paper. And the body of the paper for me begins with problem identification. And I'll go into a little more depth on that. That is where we set up the thesis statement, essentially, the crux of the entire plan. That will be what everything else flows from and through and is confirmed at the end as being solved through their strategic plan. Then there's the situation analysis that is not regurgitating what was in the case, is not telling us what the client already knows, but is the research beyond the case that says, this is how we're building a foundation for building alternatives. I always recommend 3 alternatives. That way they do more than just choose the low-hanging fruit. Then they have to prove that all 3 alternatives are viable. An alternative suggests what we do, how we do it. Then comes the recommendation and the implementation. The implementation should roughly be about 1/3 of their final paper, and it should be supported by a considerable number of appendices telling us the what, who, where, when, how much, etc. And then there's the back material where you have a conclusion, references, and appendices. Let's move forward and talk about how do we determine what the primary marketing tool is, because quite often in my experiences, the class that they've had that resonates loudest by the time they get to their senior year and to marketing management, strategic marketing, is the promotions or integrated marketing communications course. Problem is not most things cannot be solved by just adjusting the IMC plan. And so I have created this chart here that helps them to focus that we have to think about our target audience. And the customer going forward may be, and probably should be, many of the customers that we had in the past, but we have to think about who they will be going forward. Perhaps our past customers have aged out. Maybe their lifestyles have changed, whatever. We need to analyze, the students need to think about who their customers going forward will be, and starting with that group, then how does the product or service align? What price and place considerations there need to be, and then the promotion. So everything starts with the customer and how that product or service serves them, because the rest is not relevant if we haven't identified that. And here's a tool, and this will be in the handout, of how students can go about, and I'm sorry for the odd scrolling there, how students can understand the difference between symptoms, which are usually what clients present in their intakes. They'll say, oh, my problem is that my sales are down. Problem is sales being down are never the problem. That's a symptom of a problem. And we know that, but students often don't think through that because what they heard the client say was, oh, my problem is sales are down. And so I have provided this handout, and I won't go through this, but that breaks down some of the common questions that students should ask across the 4 Ps, and sort of in the order. They should always start with product, because fundamentally, if the product's not right, if there isn't a good fit, if the customers don't understand that differential benefit that they derive from using your product and or service, using the term product broadly, then the rest doesn't matter. Now, if they find that all of these are correct and they've got a great product and it's well defined and customers understand, etc., then they move forward, analyzing next the placement, the price. Those two can fluctuate depending upon the nature of the case. And then the very last thing they should think to adjust is the IMC. For the purposes of strategic planning, though, you don't adjust everything. You have to first define what is the problem. And I actually call this section for my students problem identification. And I tell them that the first sentence of the first paragraph in this section should be that thesis statement, that problem identification that in a singularly, clearly written, concise statement tells the reader what the rest of the paper is going to be about. It's what each alternative will be evaluated against, and it is what the final solution will be evaluated against. There's 3 parts to that problem statement. The first is, what is the primary marketing tool that will be adjusted? product, place, price, or promotion. Now, clearly there might be an opportunity to morph that a little and be more selective, but you don't want to be so selective that you simply say that it must be their IMC or it must be their personal selling, because there's probably other things. So, but they should frame it by context. The next thing that they have to think about is the customer focus. And I'll show you shortly a customer focus value chart that I use to help students identify what's important to the customer. The customer not being their client, the customer being the client's customer. What are the values that resonate with them and how do they connect with the organization? Because if you're not making that connection, you're not going to capture the attention and hold it of that target audience. And the other thing then is that delta, that change, the action oriented that needs to happen so that we know where we're at to begin with and what's the change that we'll affect and how we'll measure it at the end. So as an example of a singular sentence, a problem statement might read like this. The Historic Piedmont Society needs a product strategy creating superior programming, community outreach, and educational experiences to increase visitors from 7,500 to 10,000. Then they can go on and under that section, elaborate, provide context, define what superior programming might mean, etc. This is the customer focused values that I suggest they begin with. Okay, and so understanding where they connect, and as you see, as you move around, on the left is the consumer, on the right is the customer. It doesn't mean that there isn't some crossover, but they should probably choose a couple of those values so that they can find that one point where they're going to connect, where that one point that maybe differentiates them from the competitors or from what the customer is currently using and choosing. The next part of their paper then should be the situation analysis going forward, not that led to the problem, not that the client already shared with them, but that is building through their research beyond the case that builds where they will go. And the first element that should always be there, always the first element, is the customer, because if everything is not focused on that customer, we'll lose them. So the customer, we might call it a renter, we might call it a student, we might call it an alum, a parishioner, a member. Any of those kind of words could be substituted for customer, but generically, who is the customer going forward? That's where we're going to have them explore the psychographics, the behavioral graphics of the customers generically and specifically for that client. Then the other elements that should be explored relevant to solving that problem would be, and not in any particular order other than a logical order, would be those things that we typically find in the marketing environment. So technology, culture, social, political, legal, infrastructure, competition. There may be other elements to add in as well, but this is where they're building the foundation for their alternatives. As I said before, I highly recommend at least 3 alternatives. That way you force the students to be a little more depth-oriented in their research, and also not just to take the first thing that comes along. They have to think them through, and each of these alternatives need to be proven to solve the problem. So the alternative should be named, not 1, 2, 3. We're an orderless society. When we do that, we're telling them which one is the best one. So give them a name. Each of the alternatives should be developed in adequate depth so that we know what could happen and why. It should integrate a sound marketing model. So this goes back to pulling on their previous knowledge of marketing experience from their previous courses. They need to analyze the alternative, advantages and disadvantages, and then prove how it solved the problem. And then they do that for each of the different alternatives. Here's an example for the problem statement I said earlier. I said it was a product problem. So they need to choose an appropriate model for that marketing tool. So 5 product layers goes back to Kotler 1964. Clearly in our textbooks, we have 3-layer models and we have other models out there, but I'm just showing this as an example of how they might go look at that model and say, oh, where does this fit? How does this help to inform my decisions for building an alternative? Because we want them to remember that they're not marketing theorists yet. They need to rely on sound theories. The next step would be the evaluation, which happens in the recommendation of all three alternatives. So here are, for the problem statement I gave earlier, historic Piedmont needing a product strategy for superior programming, community outreach, and educational experiences to increase visitors from 7,500 to 10,000. So here's a table, and I highly recommend my students put this in the appendices so that we can refer to it as they're evaluating the alternatives, and then in the recommendation. The three alternatives by name were family and friends, fun and groups, and school groups. For each, we have programming, outreach, and educational experiences, because that is the customer focus values. The proof, meaning the how it's going to catch the measurable. And then in this one, we included risk, because there's some significant risks that could happen with some of their solutions, because the historic Piedmont is an outdoor recreation area. Family and friends, it talks about in programming, how that, and this is just a generic synthesis or a limited synthesis of what they would have written up in their alternative. Of course, they'd have supported it with the marketing model, et cetera, but it shows across the programming what they would be doing, right? How they would reach these people. So Adams and Franklin County, which is in the historic Piedmont area, Greene County as well, who they would be targeting, how they would supply educational experiences. Some of this could be overlapped. You can use the same tool in more than one. It just can't be used in the same quantity, or there needs to be some differences, right? And then proof. So the numbers, the number of people in the counties, of course, across the two counties, there are 39,000 people. If only 2% came, that'd be 700 and some. If each of those people came 4 times, once a season, doesn't seem unreasonable. There's a lot to do at the historic Piedmont. Then it shows that they would have an increase of 3,000 people, which would more than meet their measurable. And then the last column here is a row is the risks related to it. All three are proven to be viable. All of them have some risks. They need to then choose one, and only one, to implement. If they say, well, we're going to combine all three and do that, then that means that all three did not stand alone. So in the implementation, which should roughly be about 1/3 of the paper, this is really the meat of the paper. The other was the supporting piece that allowed to justify this. This now says, for this client, and speaking to that client, this is what you need to do, and this is how you're going to do it. And it layers in a budget for a year, a timeline for a year, maybe longer depending upon the needs of the client, but I usually keep them focused at about a year. It's very granular. It's going to be supported by things in the appendices. So spec sheets of things they have to order, people they need to meet, lists of contacts, mocks of items that they need to create, promotional materials. And in the implementation, once they solve that primary P of the statement, they have to think about the consideration of the other 3 Ps as well, and make the adjustments appropriate after they've solved that primary P. Then, of course, there's the back material that follows, the conclusion that should persuasively demonstrate and convince the client as they read it that this is the solution that will allow them to, within their resources, meet the needs to solve what they said they wanted to accomplish. And then, of course, references and appendices. A minimum would be, in the appendices would be a year-long timeline and in a year-long budget. So let me move forward now and talk to you about the text that I wrote. And this is a compilation of clients that I've had over the years. As Ryan shared, I've had over 325 unique clients through my classes through the years. And some of them have been similar clients. One of the clients that is in the textbook is a church. My students have actually worked with 5 different churches of 5 different denominations, but there were some similarities across all of them. And so I have bundled those problems together and created a singular case. Some were singular clients, and so it is simply those clients. There's a dress shop, and that was a multi-generational dress shop. And what do you do in the 3rd generation when the downtown district has changed and those kind of things? For each of those cases, there's an opportunity for you to assign a particular community. I created 3 communities, Smallville, Midville, and Granville, where each of those are a composite of from 150 communities. I looked at 3 communities based on some parameters I set, 3 communities from every state. I collected 97 points of observation of those communities, then sorted them based upon population and summarized. And so for each profile, you have a population in Smallville of 63,000, 177,000 for Midville, and over 600 for Granville. But for each of those, then I have developed some basic demographic information, social recreational opportunities, the natural environment, included things about the business and political structure. What kind of city government, county government might they have? What kind of Chamber of Commerce support that they have, because oftentimes students aren't familiar with Chamber of Commerce's. So I've put those kind of informations in so that they think to look to them for those communities. I've listed major industries. Again, this is from a composite across the communities. Transportation, weather, those kind of things that will affect some of their decision making. I've also created an artificial map. These are not real counties, these are not real cities, but have created a map so that they are in proximity, gives them lists of institutions of higher ed, so that they can understand and look up what that community feels like, so that they can understand their decision making. From that, in this next edition, the second edition that will be available come fall, there are 16 different cases, which across then those 3 communities provide you actually with 48 different kinds of opportunities for the students. As I said, none of these are named by the real company, and none of these communities actually exist. That means that they will not be able to do a Google search and find these cases and these communities anywhere. They will have to rely on the information given in the text for the client and for the community. So they can't be looking up information about Nike, let's say, and finding out what Nike actually did. They're going to have to use that information along with that outside research that they did in their situation analysis about the trends, about larger political issues that might be affecting the industry, regulations, about changes in society as a whole affecting social and cultural changes, etc. In the book also, I have walked through the case analysis process that I shared with you and how you might share that with your students. Each of the cases has a particular product, price, place, promotions focus, but the students might look at it in a different way. There is not a correct answer, is what I tell my students. There are sometimes some wrong answers, but there's not necessarily a correct answer, because everybody and every time and the amount of research that they do will inform them differently. So I would not expect similar responses necessarily from students. As long as they can justify it and prove they did the research, it could be a correct answer. I also provide support in the book for where they might find additional resources, and that then will help you to guide them as well. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to read the questions that perhaps people have put in the chat section.
Thank you so much, Renee. We do have several questions here, and I encourage you to keep submitting those questions using the Q&A portal or the chat function. One person loved the idea of the 3 alternatives, and I love that too. Going beyond the low-hanging fruit, I think, is what you said. Do clients ever choose the alternatives? And if so, how does that process work?
Actually, because the clients work with competitive agencies, at least 2 and sometimes 3 agencies will work for the same client. They'll all have the initial intake, so they get the same information initially from the client, but then they have to work independently. And if I see suspicious interactions, we have a serious discussion. Yes, the clients, probably over 85% of the clients that I have had through the years have implemented at least some elements of the projects. Often they don't choose a singular plan because if this is a class project, so they own all of the plans, which wouldn't happen if they went out to outside agencies. But in this case, they get all 3 plans. They usually find that, oh, gee, usually, we know our students, we've got one really good team that really applied themselves, who probably nailed 50% or better, but there's some good ideas with the other cases too. And so they usually integrate things across. Oftentimes I have had them reach out to me and to the students. My students get engaged with these clients and have worked beyond the class to help implement them. I think probably the best one was a client that stayed engaged with the students through the planning process, which the students are supposed to do that, knew that part of the plan was going to be a billboard, bought the billboard space based upon what the students said they were going to recommend, knowing that they would have that billboard, an electronic billboard. The meeting was at 10 a.m. By 5 o'clock, the billboard was up.
Wow.
They took the file and sent it to the company and it was up. I've had other clients that have waited 18 months, 2 years to begin implementing, but sometimes that was also an indicator that was there before they came to work with my students, that they were already a bit in trouble, and partly because of poor planning and organization. But yes, most all of my clients have implemented at least some elements from the plans.
That's great. And do they pay to do this, or is this strictly, how does that work?
Georgia College and State University is a state university in a relatively depressed rural community. So I'm not allowed to charge. And I do know some universities are able to do that, usually more in urban areas. What I have instead done is I started a scholarship fund when I came to Georgia College. And as clients find that they use the students' work and want to remunerate them in some way, I ask that they make contributions to that scholarship fund in those students' names. As a result, within 18 months, we had the scholarship fund fully vested, and we were able to start giving scholarships.
Wow.
And it continues to get donations. So that's been my alternative. I would say probably 20% of my clients make a contribution.
That's really good that you're helping the community and students as well. In your experience, what part of the strategic plan takes the longest?
The part that takes the students the longest, once they get past the procrastination of starting, we all know that one, right? Which makes, I help them along in that they have to have a team meeting with me shortly after I assign the case to go over their problem identification, to make sure that they're on the right track with their problem statement, because otherwise the rest of the paper falls apart. And that at least gets them started. The piece that's going to take them probably the longest has been the research section in the situation analysis, because they always want to draw on what was in the case. And they're always like, well, where do I get that information? And they want to find that if they put in a Google term, they want to find something pop up in the first window or two, or first section of Google. And it's often takes a little deeper dive than that. So that probably takes them the longest. The section of the paper that is the longest, though, is the implementation, because that is so finite and defined in terms of what do we do, how are we doing it, when are we doing it, how much is it going to cost, the interrelationships of when do we order it, when will it arrive, where will we store it, when will we implement it. All of those things need to be part of that implementation. And so in terms of the length of the paper, that's the largest.
And how do you evaluate students' performance? Is it based on client feedback, or is it based?
Good question. So my students make both an oral and a written report. The written report I solely grade, and I have a rubric that I created. Actually, Ray Fisk, who was my mentor when I taught at University of New Orleans at the beginning of my, well, actually I was ABD still, helped me to define the initial rubric. And I have changed that over time, but it looks at the structure, the logic, the flow, the research, is it well written, grammar, and all those kind of things. All right, so I use that rubric. I have had others use that rubric, and it holds up as being fairly robust and that we get similar results. The oral presentation, I have the clients come and they can bring whoever they wish. I often recommend that they bring their board with them. They come to the class, they see the final presentation. At one point, 25 years ago, they used to be hour-long presentations. Now they're down to 15 or 20-minute presentations. Each agency makes their presentation. The client then uses the rubric and evaluates based upon what they're seeing right then on the oral presentation. And so, was it organized? Were they professionally attired? Something I require, because this is a senior level course. They need to be able to present themselves as if they truly were an agency on the other side of their degree, which they would be in less than 3 months. Not that they're still a student. So professional attire, which we've gone over in class, those kind of things in preparation. Being able to share, they all have to present. They can't just have one person who's presenting the slides. They all have to speak. They all have to engage with the audience, and they have to be able to answer questions, which is part of what they're evaluated on. Their slides need to be professionally prepared, and any other materials that they use. And so the clients evaluate, and each representative of the client who's there submits an evaluation. I also evaluate just in case a client goes really wrong.
That's
what I
very
have found that if there are, most of my clients, of course, I coach them in advance of what the expectations would be, but most of my clients' evaluations are within a few points of mine. They're never more than, I think probably the biggest variation I've ever seen is maybe 8 to 9% difference.
Oh, okay. That's helpful that there's a rubric that helps you analyze their performance. One other question. What are some examples of clients that you've worked with in the past?
So the range is very broad. So food, online companies, nonprofits, quasi-governmental agencies. Let me share some that are in this textbook. There is a woman's dress shop, which is in the old downtown district of the community. There is a university agency, so the students should be more familiar with that. And if you wanted to take the case instead of Smallville, Midville, Grandville, and make it your university, but use this scenario, that would be fine too. You could do it that way. There is a county humane society that was getting part of its funding from the county, and the county threatened to cut their funding. And so what would they do as a fundraiser, and how would they do that when it's a volunteer-based organization? There is a gym, and I have touched base with this gym. This is one of the new clients in this edition. I had initiated, well, they'd been a client many years ago, and of course what happened when they were planning their business, they started their business at the beginning of 2019. They had been talking about launching it. They launched it in 2019, and of course we know very shortly they had to shut down. And so it's talking about what is happening now, because they had a bunch of members that they lost. They lost about 45% of their base. And so what are they doing in this new COVID environment? And so how will they move forward on that? There are, of course, ones related to food. Boy, now I'm drawing a blank on some of the others. A church. I like to put a church in because it's something that a lot of students haven't thought much about as a business. They don't understand that even churches have to have members, which are customers. They have to make a profit. They have to, or not a profit, but they have to have money to support what they do. And the churches are really an integral part of many communities, supporting a lot of different things, often food pantries and things like that, that often our college students might not be aware of. And so looking at some of the social justice issues, I try to have created cases that have some gender neutrality in them. So students will not be able to say, oh, well, that's a man's business, that's a woman's business. Some of them I clearly have identified genders because it is relevant to finding the right solution for them. I have used generic names where I can. I have also put in some that are very ethnic names to maybe help students look beyond and maybe identify themselves. So there's some social justice elements worked into some of the cases for students' consideration as well.
That's outstanding. It really is a wonderful approach to teaching this. I'm super excited. I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And to the attendees, thank you so much. As a final note, I invite you to join us for future webinars such as these. We're hosting a webinar on skills to help students identify themselves, their beliefs, and identify their identities. That's next Thursday, and a webinar on designing a course for first-year seminar. That's on June 29th. To learn more and reserve your spot, visit he.kendallhunt.com/events. A reminder, in the coming days, you'll receive a copy of this recording, contact information for our panelist, along with the wonderful handout that she provided. And I'll also include a copy of the PowerPoint as well, so you can view it. So I'll be sending that as a PDF here in the coming days. Thank
Ryan,
you so much, Renee.
Ryan, please include my email. I'm welcome to any questions you want to have with me after this discussions or after this seminar. Please feel free, email me. I see there's another question that came in, and if I can, I'd like to take a moment to answer. And it says, can the value be employee oriented rather than client oriented? The values are customer oriented. It's who we are affecting. So if the employee, maybe you're an organization and you're the university and you want to get employees, faculty to attend webinars that the Center for Teaching and Learning is hosting, that would be an employee focus, but it's the customer as well, because the employee is the customer. So if you're dealing with an internal issue, perhaps for the client, it could be an employee value, but you want to take the customer, the person we're serving, our target audience, whoever that is, and connect their value with the company value. Because if they don't see that, they're not going to recognize themselves in your organization or as a customer of yours. And if you want to have that conversation with me offline, please feel free to email me. What if your case study is an internal issue within the organization? Yeah, I hope I answered that. So yeah, it certainly can be. And the one from the university is sort of an internal issue. It directly relates to, as I just said, faculty attending webinars offered through and services offered through the Center for Teaching and Learning. Many universities are trying to enlarge their Center for Teaching and Learning, and disciplines out of education often don't see themselves in that center. It seems to draw heavily from the educational faculty who understand, but those in biology and the sciences, in business, don't understand that they have skills and things that they can teach us as well. I hope I've answered your question. I look forward to sharing more with you all. I hope that you will consider using this textbook. I've had a lot of fun writing it. It's been a labor of love, and it comes from a tremendous amount of experience that my clients and students have worked through the years. My best to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure working with you, and always good to see you through the camera here, but hope you're doing well, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.